Coming up on this edition of The Climate Show, we talk about the most extreme year since 1816. And our guest, Gareth,
is Professor Michael Ashley from the University of New South Wales in Sydney, Australia. And we talked to him about what's been happening in Australia.
Plus solutions, more fast electric cars.
And a non-solution, the use of shale gas for energy.
That's all coming up on this edition of The Climate Show. This episode of The Climate Show is brought to you by Celsius.co.nz, HotTopic.co.nz, SkepticalScience.com, Scoop.co.nz, and Kiwi FM.
What good is a drop in the ocean? What good is a drop in the ocean?
Welcome along to another edition of The Climate Show. This is episode number 15, recording June 28th, 2011. My name is Glenn Williams here, recording from the Kiwi FM studio in Ponsonby, Auckland City, New Zealand. My co-host, of course, is Gareth Ronaldon at Hot-Topic, based in Waipara, North Canterbury. Hello, Gareth.
Hi, good morning, Glenn. How are you?
Very well, thanks. Of course, if you're just brand new to The Climate Show, it's a show all about climate science, news, policy, politics, and solutions. And we've got another cracker of a show lined up, Gareth.
Yeah, it's going to be good. We're going to do a quick whiz round some news, building on stuff we talked about in the last show, and some interesting stuff coming up. We've got Professor Michael Ashley from the University of New South Wales talking to us about what's been going on in Australia recently in terms of science and skeptics and politics and so on. So that's going to be fascinating. John Cook will be along, and we've even got some solutions, or non-solutions even, to talk about.
Yes,
so
non-solutions. It's funny to put that in the solutions in there, but we will put that towards the end of the show. Now, if you're following along with the show and you say, oh, I want to find out a little bit more about what we're talking about, don't panic. We do have a website. It's called theclimateshow.com and also hot-topic.co.nz, and that's where you'll find not only the show itself but all the links and show notes to everything that we're talking about as well. And before we crack on with the show, I do want to mention that we are now available on smartphone devices like Android, iPhone, BlackBerry and Palm devices through Stitcher, which is an application that basically takes radio from all over the planet and radio podcasts and literally stitches them together into categories, or you can customize your own station. And I've been using it quite a bit recently, and it just really does make sense. I often try and get my dose of world news through Stitcher, and it'll stitch together NPR and BBC and ABC and all these sources, and over the period of an hour I'll get a decent selection of what's going on around the world. And we're in the environment section under the science category in Stitcher, and we're in pretty good company there, I've got to say, Gareth, with some
absolutely
some pretty good radio partners around the world. So check that out at Stitcher.com. We'll also have the link in the show notes, and you can always download the app from your app store, whether it be your Android store or your iPhone store or BlackBerry or WebOS store. So that's very, very cool, and a nice, easy way.
It's a free app as well, isn't it?
It is completely free, yeah. And it's just an easy way of getting the audio, not the video at this stage, but the audio through to your smart device. But let's crack on with the news. First up, Gareth, we're looking at the volcanoes in Eritrea.
Yes, absolutely. The Nabro eruption we referred to, the Puyeye Cordoncaye, the Chilean volcano, has been causing flight chaos over New Zealand on and off. But I wanted to just focus on the Nabro eruption because there are some spectacular images being generated by NASA. And the one that Glenn's got on screen at the moment shows not only the great big smoke plume coming up from it, but also the lava flows that have been erupting from the crater over the last week or so.
That's spectacular, that image. Amazing.
Oh, it is just gorgeous. I mean, I say gorgeous. Well, it is in visual terms. It's not particularly good on the ground there. At least 3,500 people, and perhaps as many as 9,000, have been directly affected by the eruption. There have been 7 deaths. But more importantly, and the reason I'm mentioning it on a show called The Climate Show, is that it's been putting prodigious quantities of sulfur dioxide high up into the atmosphere. And sulfur dioxide is the stuff that can make aerosols, which can reflect the sun and introduce a cooling effect into the climate system. And we're going to talk a little bit later on about one particular year, 1816, which is the year without the summer, and that was caused by an absolutely massive volcanic eruption in Indonesia. And I'm not saying that Nabro is anything like that at the moment, but it has been chucking sulfur dioxide up there. I haven't seen anyone trying to estimate what its impact might be at the moment, or whether it's produced enough to have any kind of impact at the moment beyond ash worrying the flight patterns in the Middle East. But it's one to watch, and we're blessed by having the most amazing pictures to watch. So we're one to keep an eye on. I think.
Is there any talk at the moment of this buying humanity another year or so?
Well, it would take a very big eruption. I mean, the Tambora eruption of 1816 caused about 2 years worth of cooling, I think. And the last really major one was Pinatubo, which caused a global cooling of about 0.1 degrees Celsius, something like that. So, it doesn't seem to be anything like that scale at the moment. But yes, I mean, if you get a volcano that introduces a sort of cooling spike, yes, that will kind of delay things for a while. But once the aerosols in the stratosphere get washed out and fall out of the atmosphere, the warming will be back with a vengeance. And if we, the amount of CO2 will have gone up in the interim, so the climate forcing will still be there, and it will be larger. It's a bit like the solar cycle. The 11-year solar cycle, you get a slight variation in the amount of energy reaching the Earth from the sun over the 11-year solar cycle. And one of the interesting things about 2010 being a record warm year was that it was achieved at the minimum of the solar cycle. Now, when we reach the maximum of the current cycle over the next sort of 3, 4, 5 years, you'd expect the climate to get a warming boost from that on top of all the extra CO2. So.
Okay, all right. Well, we're moving along. Everyone who's listened to the Climate Show for the past 14 episodes would know we love a good graphic, but right up there with a good graphic is a good list. And
oh, absolutely.
Weather Underground founder Jeff Masters has put together a list of the things that have happened in the past year, the worst year since 1816.
Yeah, that's why I mentioned 1816. It's because Jeff Masters, we've talked about his blog as a must-watch blog several times in the show, and he's pulled together this list of the things that have happened in the atmosphere over 2010, 2011 that they're all extreme weather events, and he's tried to put them all together and looked back through the books and can't really find a year that has anything similar until he gets back to this absolutely massive volcanic eruption in 1815, which caused cooling in 1816 and 1817. 1816 was actually called the year without a summer because basically they were getting snow and ice on lakes in June and July in North America. Crop failures, there were people were starving, people in Wales were begging in the streets. They were kind of leaving Wales and going through England, begging in the streets for food because the crops simply failed. So what Jeff did, he went back and he looked over. He said about 2010 was the hottest year on record. It tied with 2005. You had 19 countries setting new hot temperature records over that period. We had the incredible extreme Arctic atmospheric circulation record, which caused all that cold weather we talked about. That was caused by the Arctic atmospheric circulation virtually reversing direction for a period of time.
Yeah.
And all the cold air that should have been bottled up north came whizzing down and troubled Europe and North America.
That's right.
Then we had the third record lowest Arctic summer ice extent, with both the northwest and northeast passages open at the same time, and it was the lowest volume on record as far as our modelling indicates. Massive iceberg in Greenland and record melting. One of our previous guests, Jason Box, is hoping to get a picture of that massive calving event when he manages to get up to that part of Greenland. And I think he's hoping to get up there later on this Northern Hemisphere summer. So we're looking forward to hearing from you, Jason, when you've got that beautiful picture.
Yeah.
The weather flipped from a really strong El Nino to a strong La Nina in the course of the year, which was a fairly dramatic shift. It was the second worst coral bleaching year on record, the wettest year over land. The Amazon rainforest had its second 100-year drought in 5 years. Is that a coincidence? Although tropical cyclone activity was the lowest on record around the world, the Antarctic actually had a hyperactive hurricane season, even if none of them caused huge damage in the US. And then we had rare tropical storms in the South Atlantic. We had really powerful storms in the US. The weakest Asian monsoon on record, no monsoon depressions in India, the Pakistani flood event, the Russian heat wave, record rains in Queensland over the end of 2010 and into 2011. Colombia's worst flooding ever. 1 in 1,000-year flood in the US and Tennessee. Just a remarkable sequence of events.
Now, I haven't read the columns or read the comments in these in these blogs, but a critic of this list would say, you could go to any year and pick out a bunch of records. I mean, strange new things happen every single year. So can he conclusively say this is the worst year because of what he's listed?
I think it's difficult we couldn't be precise about 1816 being as bad, because there's so many different things to look at and so many different things to count and so many records to look at. And yeah, it may well be that because we've got global communication systems and we're actually looking for these things, that we're seeing more of them. But nevertheless, we're looking at record-breaking events in lots and lots of different categories. We've got record snow, we've got record heat, we've got record drought, we've got record floods. All of these things are happening at the same time, and in some cases we know for a fact that those records go back hundreds of years and so on. So it's not so much the individual events, although they are themselves interesting, because individual events are actually quite difficult to tie into climate change because weather happens, and so to tie them into the fact that it was caused by an increase in the energy in the system for an individual event can be quite hard. But the point that Jeff's making is that when you look at these all together and look at the big picture, what you see is a really extraordinary year to 18 months. So the question that he actually asks is this the new normal? And his view is that this is not the new normal. It's because we've had the El Nino, the ENSO switchover has kind of imposed a pattern that has brought all these extremes together at the same time. So if you like, it was bad luck that everything came together and gave us all those extremes. And so he's expecting that we probably will not be getting the same concatenation of events in the near future. But he does think that this is a bit of a picture for what may become normal in 20 to 30 years' time.
Okay.
The quote I wanted to read out was that what he actually says is the ever-increasing amounts of heat-trapping gases humans are emitting into the air puts tremendous pressure on the climate system to shift to a new, radically different, warmer state. And the extreme weather of 2010, 2011 suggests that the transition is already well underway. And that, as I put in my blog post, it's not being alarmist to say that that's an alarming conclusion.
Indeed. Well, let's move on to another alarming conclusion, that the heat waves that have been reported are not just a lot of hot air.
Yeah, I just wanted to pop this link in because it was relevant to Jeff Masters' post. It's by Neville Nichols at Monash University in Australia. And what he does is he looks at some of the Australian heat records, and he finds a very clear linkage between the warming of the climate and the fact that the heat records are being broken on a regular basis. So it's at a very interesting site called The Conversation that we're going to talk about with Professor Michael Ashley, but which is an Australian site, which is well worth looking at the RSS feed from. But what the point he makes is that
heat waves are caused by weather, but it's climate change that makes them hotter than they used to be.
Yeah. It's just, and as we've been talking about in previous shows, climate change just making the extremes more extreme.
Yeah, absolutely. And then we move on quickly to a new report that was released a week ago on the state of the ocean. And a bunch of ocean scientists, yes, you can see them on screen now, got together in Oxford and reviewed basically the state of the oceans and produced a report that is very, very sobering reading. They basically find that human actions have caused warming and acidification of the oceans and are causing increasing, well, they call it hypoxia. That means, we talked about dead zones in the ocean in the last show, where the oxygen is sort of eaten out of the water by bugs and algae. And the dead zones then can't support all other forms of life. So they're causing these increasing dead zones. We've got the speeds of changes being faster or tracking the worst case scenarios from the IPCC. Magnitude of the cumulative impacts is greater than previously understood. The timelines for action are shrinking. Resilience of the ocean is being severely compromised by the pollution that we're shoving into it and the fact that we're stealing all the fish or eating all the fish and causing habitat destruction. Then we're already seeing ecosystem collapse in parts of the ocean. And that as a result of that, the extinction threat to marine species is increasing. And the bottom line, I quoted it in my piece on Hot Topic, we now face losing marine species and entire marine ecosystems, such as coral reefs, within a single generation.
Wow.
Unless action is taken now, the consequences of our activities are at a high risk of causing, through the combined effect of climate change, overexploitation, pollution and habitat loss, the next globally significant extinction event in the ocean.
And ocean acidification is, of course, one issue we're going to be covering in an upcoming climate show as well.
Absolutely. I'm hoping that we'll get Professor Keith Hunter on from the University of Otago to talk about the state of the oceans. So hopefully, Keith, if you're listening to this, I'll be on the blower very soon.
Yes. And now, finally, moving on to sea ice bets.
Yeah, absolutely. William Connolly, who blogs as Stoat at Science Blogs, has been a keen gambler on sea ice, the state of the Arctic sea ice, and he's just accepted a $10,000 bet. Now, my bets with William in the past, I've lost them all. He's a very canny gambler, is Mr. Connolly. I've lost all mine, but I was betting sort of 10 quid or a copy of my book or something. Here we've got a $10,000 bet. And basically, William is betting that the sea ice won't fall below a certain level by 2016. And the guy who's taking his bet, Rob Decker, is betting that it will. So yeah, an interesting one to follow and interesting to read the comments. There are quite a few people who are willing to have bets of various sizes on various aspects of the Arctic sea ice. So if you're going to be watching, as I said in the last show, if you're going to be watching the Arctic this summer, then you can also watch how people are nervously looking at the odds on their bets as well.
Is that through an official betting agency?
No, that's just between the two of them.
Oh, okay. Right.
But there are a couple of the internet betting things that will offer you a price on various Arctic things. I really ought to do a bit of research. Well, the New Zealand one, can you remember what it's called, Glenn?
For politics.
Yeah.
I want to say pundit. That's not right.
No.
It'll come to me. But,
yeah, well, anyway,
I predict.
That's it. I predict offered odds on the Arctic last year, I think. I haven't checked to see if they're doing it this year, but there are a couple of those things around the world that are looking at the Arctic.
Good. All right.
Well, anyway, one to watch.
One to watch. We'll get our guest on very shortly, but first up, I do want to thank a couple of media partners, scoop.co.nz, for helping us out and getting the climate show up there, featuring the climate show, but all sorts of news and information throughout the week. And in fact, right now, featuring the trials going on over in Cambodia, 4 of the Khmer Rouge sort of leaders on trial over there. That's very interesting to follow. And of course, over at Celsius, CELSIAS.co.nz, And as we just mentioned before, nice of Stitcher to have us up on their smartphone app that you can find in your app store on the iPhone, Android, BlackBerry and other devices as well.
And our special guest this week is Professor Michael Ashley, who's an astrophysicist at the University of New South Wales. But we're not got him on to talk about astrophysics because Michael's been very involved in attempts by Australian scientists to address the kind of rash of skepticism that's been infecting the public discourse in Australia. Would that be a good way to describe it, Michael?
Yes, I guess that's true. It's something I've been passionate about for some time, and I guess it's something I'm really interested in doing.
Yeah, you took part with Steve Lewandowski and many other academics in a series of articles at The Conversation. And the one that I've got on screen here is titled "A Journey into the Weird and Wacky World of Climate Change Denial." And I thought it was a great article, first of all.
Thank you.
I love the idea that somehow we're being oppressed by David Attenborough and the Archbishop of Canterbury, and
Yes.
it's good stuff. So your interest is in the sort of antics of skeptics, obviously.
Well, partly. I mean, that's my interest really isn't in that, I suppose. My interest is in really trying to understand the science, and the more I read about the science, the more concerned I get about it. And I just feel that at the moment, there's so much misinformation around, and people aren't realising the sort of danger we're in, and I'm just trying to address that in some way.
Yeah, that's true. And it seems that a great deal of the Australian science community agrees with you because of the fact that we have people like Bob Carter and Ian Plimer and so on getting a huge amount of exposure in a certain sector of the media. Kind of distorts the public perception of the scale of the problem. How much frustration is there in the scientific community in Australia?
I think there is a great deal of frustration, and I think it's mainly directed towards some of the mainstream media outlets who give time to people like Carter and Plimer when they've been shown time and time again to be incorrect. And this frustration is one of the things that led to this series of articles in The Conversation, where we're able to actually write the articles and get them published without having to go through an opinion editor who very often just throws out what we write or doesn't even, it basically doesn't print what we ask them to. So The Conversation is a tremendous opportunity to reach the public directly and uncensored. And
yes, explain for our listeners and viewers exactly what The Conversation is, because I think it's an absolutely fascinating media experiment.
Yes, it is. It's been running for a few months now. It was set up with, I guess, the idea to really allow experts from the university and research sectors to directly pitch articles and write articles and have them out there in a sort of a media blog type presence, so that it removes the barriers to communicating which you find if you have to go through a newspaper. Because quite often, for example, you'd read something in the Australian which is absolutely outrageous. You'd then suggest an opinion piece to try to counteract it, but it would just be ignored. And so many scientists have had this happen to them that people have pretty much given up trying to correct the distortions in the mainstream media. And it's just very frustrating. I mean, we had a sad situation just yesterday, in fact, where Bob Carter was given an opinion piece in The Age, Fairfax newspaper in Australia. And it was just an outrageous piece. And, fortunately, The Age was willing to publish an op-ed from John Cook this morning to counteract that. But that's pretty unusual in my experience.
Yes, I was astonished at the speed with which it was done, and kudos to John for being able to do it. But I just want to, Bob Carter is a very interesting guy. He's New Zealand's best present to Australian skepticism, unfortunately. But he's an unpaid adjunct professor at James Cook University. He's basically retired. He's not being paid by the university. He's associated with think tanks, isn't he, in Australia, who presumably provide him with the wherewithal to go about doing this. But he seems to be able to repeatedly lie in public about the science of climate change. And why on earth does he get away with it?
Yes, it's very interesting, isn't it? I mean, if you look at the piece that he wrote just yesterday, he claims a number of things which he describes as facts. And for example, he says that between 2001 and 2010, global average temperature decreased by 0.05 degrees. And then he goes on to say, this shows that carbon dioxide emissions are not driving dangerous warming. Now, that's just absolutely ludicrous. I mean, any climate scientist would be able to tell you that you can't cherry pick a couple of years over the last decade and make any statement about the relationship between temperature and CO2. So the fact that he does things like that, which are just, scientifically absurd, really makes me question what he's about. The fact that he's a retired adjunct professor isn't so much of a problem. The fact that he's maybe associated with right-wing think tanks, perhaps, I don't know, that also isn't really a problem. What is a problem is that he's just basically distorting the science. And he should either doesn't know that he's distorting the science, in which case he's basically incompetent, or else he is doing it deliberately, which is even worse.
Yes, I think it's an interesting fact that those 5 points in that piece are actually things he's been saying for many years. And his errors have been pointed out to him not only by rebuttal op-eds that appear from time to time, but in blogs and even in the peer-reviewed literature. In the case of the paper that he took part in with John McLean and Krista Freitas. And yet it just doesn't seem to sink in. So you have to wonder about the degree of honesty involved in debating with someone like Carter.
Yes, it's a mystery. It's a characteristic of the denialist that despite having their errors pointed out to them, they continue to repeat them again and again. And I just find it extraordinary, particularly when they claim to be scientists. But it's a pattern that they all seem to fall into.
Yeah. So in fact, it's one of the reasons why you're co-author on that piece. Stefan, we're talking about a social problem, not a scientific one, because then they pretend to be scientists in order to make a political point, but actually what they're doing is trying to manipulate a debate and manipulate politics using social constructs rather than using scientific evidence.
Well, it's very hard to know what they're doing. I mean, to some extent, they may really believe what they're saying. I think there's a degree of incompetence. You don't necessarily think that these people are being extremely cunning and Machiavellian about how they're manipulating opinion. It could be that they're just truly misguided and basically scientifically incompetent. I think there's certainly a degree of that.
Yes, it's interesting. It would be very nice if somebody actually got on stage at some point and pointed that out to them face to face. But I gather that one of the more outrageous, if we think Bob Carter's outrageous in what he says, then you're about to have a visitation from what Joe Romm at Climate Progress, he calls him TV Mob, the Viscount Monckton of Brenchley, who I've covered many, many times on Hot Topic. He's about to turn up in Australia, but seems to have shot himself in the foot before he's even arrived.
Yes, he has, with his description of Ross Garnaut as being somewhat like a Nazi, which was a silly thing to do. But he then apologised, and I think that has probably largely eliminated that statement from the public consciousness, I think. So, apology is the right thing to do, but then again, the fact that he made that statement in the first place is indicative of the way he thinks, I suspect.
Yeah, what I particularly liked about his apology was that he said it was unparliamentary. What Monckton said was, what I said about his opinions was unparliamentary and unstatesmanlike. Now, in order for his comments to have been unparliamentary, he would have to be a member of a parliament somewhere, and Monckton is not a member of the House of Lords in Britain. And he would have to be a statesman in order to be unstatesmanlike. And Monckton is certainly not a statesman. He lives in a parallel universe, I think, where life is not as the rest of us know it.
Yes, he's certainly an extraordinary person. I've actually I've heard him speak, and he speaks very engagingly. He's an amusing person and quite fun to listen to. And he's a fantastic debater. I think he's the ideal person you want on your debating team. However, the trouble is he hasn't got truth on his side, really, and his statements have time and time again been shown to be incorrect. So he's really not worth listening to. However, in some respects, I think he's in some ways a gift, because he's so obviously, outrageously, well, I'd be careful what I say, but it's clear to just about anyone who looks at him, who listens to what he says, that he's just wrong.
But doesn't this also get down to the essence of why these opinions end up in mainstream media and mainstream newspapers all the time? Because do you think in the back of the mind the editors of these, particularly the newspapers, are thinking of it as link bait? They know that that this is an outrageous opinion. They know that there will be particularly people in the blogosphere who will be outraged by it and who will talk about the article and therefore link back to the newspaper. And I kind of get quite cynical about all this stuff and just think, well, really it's just all about profits and money and not really about the actual issues being discussed at all.
Yes, that's right. I mean, journalism has become increasingly about profit, but in a case like this, where the future of civilization is really under threat, the mainstream media has a duty, I think, to be extremely honest about this debate and not put up just ludicrous opinions from people like Monckton or Carter or Plimer, and because they know they'll get a huge reaction. They know that there'll be hundreds of letters to the editor, but it's just pointless, because there really isn't any scientific argument. And the fact that people who read these newspapers are getting the impression that there is an argument is unconscionable.
Are you getting any engagement from the mainstream media commentators at all? Are they coming over to the conversation and engaging?
I'm not really in a position to know that. I know that there have been a lot of readers of the conversation articles. I believe 40 or so thousand of the 13 articles in this series over the last 2 weeks. And there's been a little bit of mainstream media interest. I believe The Guardian had tweeted it,
yeah.
and there was a mention in a New York Times blog. But it's had a fairly small impact at the moment. I guess there's a lot of variation in quality of online blogs. I mean, I think most of the sort of skeptical climate blogs are just infested with opinions that they're just not worth listening to, really. And unfortunately, that has, to some extent, been reflected in the comments on the conversation to our articles. Yeah. Where you can see, every example of denialist trolling and bad blog behaviour, and it really is actually virtually pointless responding to these people, because you'll never convince anyone, and they'll just we've been round and around and around this merry-go-round so many times.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is. Speaking as someone who runs a blog in this very area, it is one of the hardest things to. You want to have a conversation. You want people to discuss and talk about things, but unfortunately, there are. I call them the ineducable. Will turn up and they will simply have an argument for an argument's sake, which is all very amusing when it's Monty Python, but I'm afraid isn't when it, as you said, it's the future of the planet at stake.
Yeah, no, it's very difficult. I mean, moderation of the comments is obviously critical, but it's a fine line between, excessive moderation and allowing trolls in.
Yes, absolutely. And it's, of course, one of the things I'm looking at a piece in The Guardian this morning by Leo Hickman talking about a letter that academics were circulating in Australia calling on the University of Notre Dame in Fremantle to cancel a lecture due to be given by Monckton later this week. And it's a sort of devil, you're hung both ways, really, because if you cancel his lecture, then you're censoring free speech or preventing free speech. And if you let him go ahead, you're effectively giving him a stage to promote the non-factual representation that he's so fond of pushing.
Yes, that's right. Well, I think the key thing is that speeches from Monckton shouldn't be at venues which are controlled by universities, because that sort of gives the stamp of approval of the university to his talk. So by all means, he should have freedom of speech, but let him hire a hall somewhere and do it that way rather than try and get the stamp of approval of a university.
Yeah. I thought what was interesting about that particular Notre Dame lecture was that it's actually being paid for by one of the biggest mining interests in Australia, Gina Reinhardt.
Mm. Yes, that's right. There do appear to be miners behind the scenes here, which is interesting. In fact, which just brings me to one point, actually. I was engaging with someone on the conversation comments just last night. And one point I made is that the people that would benefit most from disproving global warming are the mining companies. So just imagine if you could somehow prove that, for example, burning coal had no effect on the climate. That would be a huge win for mining companies. So if you were a mining company, what would you do? I mean, if I was a mining company, I'd put up a prize of, say, $100 million to a climate scientist who could disprove global warming. And, if there was any such proof, the person could come forward and claim their money. But I think the fact that the mining companies aren't doing that sort of thing, and they aren't trying to set up their own research institutes to prove that global warming isn't happening, really indicates that they know that there isn't actually any proof, and that global warming is actually true.
Yeah, it's a wonderfully cynical way of looking at things. But the so-called skeptical scientists, and let's not include Moncton in that, but talking about people like Richard Lindzen, for instance, they are still attempting to publish papers that indicate warming isn't going to be as bad as it should be, but the papers are simply not getting any traction because they're not convincing their peers that they're finding anything interesting. There is no science being done that countermands the sort of prevailing view, and that is that we have a problem.
That's right. I mean, the skeptics will point to a list of allegedly 900 papers which have been published disputing global warming. But if you actually look at that list, you find that many of the papers don't actually address the issue anyway, and all the rest of them really, if you look in detail, they've essentially been debunked. I mean, there isn't any single paper which casts any significant doubt on global warming. And you just shouldn't count up the number of papers. You should look at their impact in the peer-reviewed literature. And these 900 papers have basically sunk like a stone and have had zero impact.
Yeah. So the situation in Australia, politically, we're working towards Julia Gillard and her introduction of a carbon tax. And obviously a lot of the frenzy in Australia, in skeptical circles, the demonstrations in the streets, the so-called death threats that scientists have been receiving. What's your reading of the political situation at the moment and the sort of mood that's infected the public debate there?
Unfortunately, I don't think it's particularly good. I mean, it seems that the general feeling in the public is that they don't want a carbon tax. People don't. The idea of calling it a tax, anything that's labelled tax, people have a reflex action to not to go along with. And I don't think it has been explained particularly well, particularly the fact that most people will be compensated for the cost of the carbon tax. And it's really just a mechanism for changing people's behaviour. That really hasn't been well articulated. So I think, unfortunately, the political landscape here is pretty bleak, and there isn't much support, as far as I can see, for a carbon tax, which is most unfortunate.
Yes, Australia has structurally very different problems to New Zealand. We have an agricultural sector, which is 50% of our emissions, but you get most of your power from burning coal. And by selling that coal to China and other parts of the world. So clearly there's a very big structural issue for Australia to address.
Yes, I'm not sure of the exact numbers, but I seem to recall that our coal constituted something like 20 or 30% of the global coal market, which is an extraordinary amount for a small country.
Absolutely.
So I'm going to check those numbers, but I think that's something like that. So we are making a big impact on global warming.
So that obviously goes some way to explaining why the mining interests in particular and the coal interests are very keen not to have to address the issue in Australia. Do you think that there is a direct link between those interests in Australia? I mean, obviously we can see that they're probably funding Moncton to come over. They are probably funding right-wing think tanks that give Carter a platform to operate from. But do you think there's any kind of appreciation of that linkage in the general public?
I don't know. It's something that I'd feel uncomfortable commenting about without evidence. I mean, I presume that mining companies are funding disinformation, but I really don't have strong evidence for that. So, it's very hard for me to say. I prefer to concentrate on the science, really.
Yeah, I can understand that, but at the same time, we've got the situation where the skeptics feel free to accuse scientists of, enriching themselves by studying global warming, and that there's a global warming gravy train that everyone's been jumping on, but they seem keen to ignore the other side of that particular coin.
Yes, there's an extraordinary amount of not misinformation. I think the public just doesn't understand how science is done. If you read some of these blog comments about scientists, and people think that they're basically just in it for the money, they're in it for grant funding, they're corrupt, and really that's just not the way science works.
Yeah, that's right. One of the things that interests me too about the way that they approach science is that they seem to believe that one paper, whether it's an old paper or a new paper, can somehow unravel the whole edifice. And they don't seem to be able to understand that, it's not the evidence for global warming is not built on a single paper, a foundation paper that if you can somehow destroy the rest of it's going to crumble. They love to claim that the hockey stick has been debunked, but the hockey stick, even if the hockey stick had been debunked, it wouldn't affect any of the other evidence that we've got across multiple lines of evidence that we face a real problem.
Yes, that's precisely right. The denialists like to concentrate on little tiny bits of information. They'll find one error somewhere, which is, in the scheme of things, absolutely insignificant. And one of the things about science is you've got to see the big picture. You've got to ignore little tiny errors, little tiny mistakes, little errors in algorithms or whatever, and concentrate on the big picture. And that is one thing that the denialists just don't seem to be able to do. They'll just always drill down to find little tiny errors here and there, as if that somehow invalidates the whole thing. But it just doesn't.
Yeah, that's interesting. There's the US guy, Bill McKibben, who founded 350.org,
Yes.
described that as the O.J. Simpson defense. And basically,
right.
what OJ's lawyers did in that first trial was get the judge and the jury to focus on the little needles in the haystack and forget that the haystack existed, which is exactly what denialists do in terms of climate science.
Yes, that's right.
Well, Michael, that's been interesting to talk to you. I've enjoyed it greatly. More power to your elbow for the work you're doing in Australia. I do think that the conversation particularly, and that sequence of articles was fantastic, really interesting and hard-hitting, it has to be said, because you didn't pull any punches. You named the Murdoch press as being reprehensible in terms of the way they're handling of the process. But it was a really fantastic series. I think the conversation is a lesson that many other countries would do well to look at as a means of getting really good information out into the public arena.
Yes, thanks for those comments. I mean, I must admit we were a bit surprised to get away with some of the things we said about the Murdoch press, but we felt it's important. I mean, scientists traditionally are very reserved, and they don't say what they think in print. But we felt that it was getting to such a stage that we really wanted to be very forthright in our opinions, and I think that. I think they are justified opinions.
But any tips on getting eyeballs onto the Conversation website? Because, I mean, you don't feature stories about Angelina Jolie there, do you?
Right, no, I guess that's the problem. Well, it'd be interesting to see how it improves over time, but it's certainly a good start.
Yeah.
You need to get Carbon Kate on the front page, obviously.
Yes, now that would really take off, wouldn't it?
With that image of Carbon Kate taking off, I think we'll draw the interview to a close, Michael. Many thanks for coming on to the Climate Show.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
And I hope we have a chance to talk again.
Yes, indeed.
Cheers. That is Professor Michael Ashley from the Department of Astrophysics, University of New South Wales. Go along to theconversation.edu.au and also don't panic because all the links will be in the show notes. All right, let's go debunk the skeptic now with John Cook. He's over at skepticalscience.com talking about the Gareth, help me out.
We're going to talk about the ineducable Bob Carter.
Ineducable.
We introduced the subject of Bob Carter when we were talking with Michael Ashley, John, and he pointed out that Bob had been given an article, an op-ed in I saw it at the Sydney Mooring Herald site, but it was in The Age apparently, yesterday, and you've today got a riposte. So run us through what you've been able to get it published to respond to Bob.
Yeah, well, I mean, Bob starts his article by saying that global warming is not happening, and I found that quite extraordinary because I would have thought by now we would have moved at least to admitting that global warming is happening and hopefully admitting that people are causing it and moving on to solutions. But Bob is still way back in that first stage of denial and saying that it's not happening. We've had slight cooling over the last 10 years. And so I just wrote a response, and it was published in The Age this morning.
So he was straight off in his article. He said there's no need for a carbon tax because dangerous global warming is not occurring. Was the his initial statement in his Sydney Morning Herald article.
Yes, and then he goes on he fleshes that out a bit more, and he says between 2001 to 2010, over the last decade, global temperatures actually decreased, and we've had slight global cooling over the past 10 years. So he's in complete denial that global warming is happening, and basically the general thrust of what I'm talking about in my response in The Age is to say that what Bob Carter does is he just gives people half-truths. He doesn't give them the full picture, and sometimes when you don't give people the full picture, that half-truth can actually turn out to be a whole lie. It gives you the opposite conclusion to what you would get if you looked at all of the evidence.
Just quickly though, how easy was it to get your response into the Sydney Morning Herald?
Well, they actually contacted me and asked me if I wanted to send in a response. So I just had till 5 o'clock to post them something.
Yeah.
So usually writing an article that long on a blog might just take an hour or two, but for some reason it took me all day to get it all finished and polished up.
Yeah.
So, and as part of what I sent them, I also sent them a graph that they didn't include, which I assumed was probably because it was just a little too nerdy, too sciencey, or maybe there wasn't room. But there's nothing too nerdy or sciencey for you guys, so I thought I'd bring it up here and flesh it out. So yeah, so what I was explaining in the article is that to understand what's happening to global temperature, you have to look at a temperature record that covers the entire globe. And what skeptics or deniers like Bob Carter always do is cite global temperature records that don't cover the entire globe. Because when you look at records like NASA GISS, which covers all the way up, including the Arctic, or there's also a temperature record by the European Centre for Medium Range Weather Forecast, and they also cover the whole globe. Both those records find that the two hottest years on record are 2005 and 2010, whereas a temperature record like from the Hadley Centre in England, that doesn't include all of the Arctic region, where warming is happening about 3 times faster than the rest of the globe. And so consequently, the Hadley Centre record underestimates recent global warming. And you can see that here in this graph, where the blue line is the Hadley Centre temperature record that doesn't cover the whole globe, and that underestimates the record, whereas a fully global temperature record covering the whole planet shows 2005 and 2010 as the hottest years on record. And Yeah, go ahead, Gareth.
No, the interesting thing there is that if you look at the blue line, the HADCRUT data, what Carter is effectively doing is drawing a line from the top of the peak in 1998 to 2010 and saying, well, look, that's going down slightly, therefore there's cooling. But in fact, if you average the 1990s and you average the first decade of this century, you find that this century is way warmer than the 1990s. Yeah. It's mendacious, I think is a good word. If we're going to call him ineducable, then we can, I think, also call him mendacious.
Well, that's fairly.
My lawyers are briefed, by the way.
It's not really appropriate just to compare single years and pick out an anonymously, like an unusually warm year, and make that your starting point. What you need to do is look at all the years and see what's happening over long periods of time. And the reason why you need to do that is because in our climate system, heat exchanges between the ocean and the atmosphere. There's heat sloshing around everywhere. And this causes a lot of internal variability where temperature jumps up and down from year to year.
Yeah.
But meanwhile, while this heat is all sloshing around, the planet is still building up heat. And you see a long-term trend, even despite all the ups and downs from year to year. So to understand what's happening to our climate, to understand whether we're experiencing global warming or not, it's inappropriate to just compare year to year. You need to look at long-term trends. And I've plotted the graph that shows the long-term trend, which considers every data point, all the years. And it shows both, even the Hadley Center record and NASA both show a long-term trend. And both of them show a warming trend even from 1998.
And that graph goes from 1970 to 2010.
Yeah, I was just plotting it a bit further. In fact, the graph that I sent into the Age, I showed it around to a few scientists for feedback, and one guy complained that I should have gone further back. So here we are. This is a longer time frame.
Yeah, just a slight comment on the newspaper thing. Newspapers often like to do the graphics themselves, and so if they were putting your piece to bed overnight, they may not have had time to get one of their artists to kind of do it in their style, if you see what I mean. So I wouldn't be too harsh on them for that.
Oh no, that's cool. And I got a blog. I'll throw it up there this morning after I get off here.
Yeah. Absolutely. No, I think it's fantastic that the paper thought to give you a response like that. Too often these things are kind of thrown into the paper, and you have to offer them a response which they then later reject or run 3 weeks later when all sort of currency has been lost.
I'm sure it's through the exposure through the climate show. It's probably why they're getting in touch these days, no doubt.
Yeah. Now you've also put up this wonderful graph, which is
no response here from John. Yeah. Anyway.
You said it all, Glenn. So.
Now, I really like the graph that you've got up here as well. It's one of the best ones at Skeptical Science, I think, and it's the Earth's total heat content anomaly. Tell us about that.
Yeah, I mean, when we talk about 1998 and climate trends and everything, it's easy to get lost in all the statistics of it all. But I think it's important to remember that the physical reality is that our planet is building up heat. That over time the oceans are accumulating heat, getting warmer, and when we look at the total heat that the planet has got, it continued to build up heat after 1998 into the 2000s, and it's still building up heat now. And papers that are coming out this year that are analysing deep ocean heat are finding that heat is accumulating even at the bottom of the ocean. So our whole planet climate system is still experiencing global warming. It's building up heat.
Yeah, and what's really interesting is that the proportion that we see on land and in the atmosphere is a tiny fraction of the total heat content anomaly, and shows just how much heat is going into the ocean. And we talked earlier in the show, John, about the recent State of the Oceans report. They released a summary of it a week or so ago, and pointing to the fact that the accumulation of CO2 and heat and so on is having a really serious impact across the global oceans. And this graph helps to underline just how serious that is.
Yeah, over 90% of global warming is going into the oceans. And in fact, I saw a paper this morning that has just come out that explores how ocean currents and ocean warming is what's causing the ice sheets to destabilize from underneath. So,
that would be the one about the Pine Island Glacier.
Yes. So did you guys talk about that earlier, did you?
No, we didn't. I haven't had time to read the paper, so it showed up in my inbox this morning, and I've had a very quick glance because I love to watch the pig flying. If you'll forgive, the Pine Island Glacier is the pig, and it has speeded up in recent times, so that's why I say the pig is flying. But yes, it's a sobering paper. That I look forward to reading it in detail. But it does look as though it's not good news. It looks like warmer water is getting underneath the glacier and increasing the melting rate.
Yeah, and that's actually one of the main contributors to why Greenland and Antarctica are losing ice at an accelerating rate, because it's thinning around the edges from all the warming water. That the ice shelves at the edges of Antarctica and Greenland are like speed bumps that are stopping the rest of the glacier from coming down. And as we remove that speed bump, they're coming down faster.
Yeah.
All right, there is a short URL to this particular debunk, and we'll let Gareth take care of that.
Absolutely. Well, in honour of the Viscount Monckton of Brenchley arriving in Australia very shortly, we shall do this in a Monktonian manner. So the short link for what we've been talking about is http://sks.to/1998.
Well done. And of course, all happening up at skepticalscience.com. Any further thoughts?
Nah, that's it for me today.
Yeah, well, we don't like your jacket, John. You better change it for the next show. Just thought we'd throw that one in.
I don't mind his jacket. There's nothing wrong with his jacket.
Well, actually, I can't see it because Skype's not working.
So you don't even know. I don't think it's even a jacket.
No, I discarded the jacket after all the rave reviews from last time. So.
Yeah, and you might notice that I don't think John ever leered at the camera, but I think he's even less leering than what he possibly might have been in the past.
You mean leaning, right?
Leaning or leering? I don't know.
Yeah. I think it was leaning that people don't like if I move too much.
God, people are so critical. Anyway, it's been good.
John, that's fantastic. Many thanks for that, and we'll get back to you in a couple of weeks. Have you got any sort of favourite topics you want to address?
Well, this morning I was going to do microsite influences, or just weather stations, and how warming influences around thermometers can affect the temperature record. Because
I wonder what's up with that, John.
Yeah, well, that was the kind of point, was the new paper that had come out about that, and there's still this obsession with photos of thermometers, but then this whole Bob Carter thing came up, so maybe we'll do that next time. Unless something else comes up.
Yeah, well, let's hope it's nothing too dramatic, and if it's a look at microsite influences, there will be, I know, some meteorologists amongst our audience who will be delighted to hear all that stuff. So, thanks, John. Look forward to talking to you soon.
Cheers, John.
See ya. Bye.
Bye-bye.
And a reminder that everything we've been talking about on today's show you can find in the show notes up at theclimateshow.com, and also hot-topic.co.nz, and all the various versions of the show there as well. But let's crack on into the solutions segment of the show, Gareth.
Absolutely. We're going for an all-time record short show this week.
Feels like it, eh? We're speeding through this.
We are. And we're going to speed on electric cars. Talk me through it, Glenn.
Yeah, okay. So I found this cool link up at CNET about an event called Refuel that is there to spur on electric car innovation, and not only from the pros, the professionals, the car manufacturers, but also from home enthusiasts as well, and get them all together and get them onto a racetrack and see what they come up with. And CNET put together a very cool slideshow, and I mean, it looks like some fantastic innovation with some classic sort of sporty looking cars, and also right down to motorbikes and minis. I noticed a little bit later on in the slideshow as well. So it shows that that it's not just industry that are trying to innovate in this area. I mean, you know, your classic home DIYer can get into electric cars and perhaps make the breakthrough that goes entirely mainstream. And heck, everyone knows how much we love these electric cars here on the Climate Show.
Yeah, it's fantastic to see that, because it just demonstrates that you don't have to be a petrol head to love cars. If you want to be into your own, particular vehicle, it can be an electric car and it can be just as good. And as we've seen repeatedly on the show, it can be just as fast, if not faster.
What I love about the engines that we're seeing on the slideshow as well is that they're so clean. There's none of the gunk and all the fossil fuel gunk that you get with engines.
Yeah, tell me about it.
Yeah.
Anyway, no, that's fantastic. I'm very impressed with that. And whilst we're on the subject of electricity, I have also dug up a news item from EcoGeek. We talked in the last show about flow batteries and how they could be a means of extending the range of electric vehicles by topping yourself up with electrolyte from a service station rather than petrol. And so it gets you around the business of having to wait ages potentially for a battery to store up. And what EcoGeek have found is that there's a test installation in California of 25 megawatt of flow battery. So it can store 25 megawatts for up to 3 hours. And it's tied into a wind farm. And basically, when the wind's blowing, but you don't need the electricity, you charge up the battery. And then when the wind's not blowing and you want the power, it can squirt it out the battery into the grid. And so the whole thing becomes, as we've talked before, about dispatchable power. Well, this is a flow battery that can deliver dispatchable power. Very interesting. Probably quite a large installation, I would think, but definitely one to watch.
Yeah. And back here in New Zealand, I noticed there was a story in the Herald, one of the main newspapers here, about a shale discovery or potential shale that we could go mining for. But you've written a post that says, well, heck, it's just not the way forward.
Well, it's not. Well, I didn't write the post, actually. It was Brian Walker, who's my co-blogger. And Brian put together a post looking at this. Company has claimed that there are large chunks of Southland and New Zealand where they can get out this stuff called shale gas. Now, shale gas, you might have heard of, is described as fracking for gas. Well, basically what they do is they have to pump fluids at very high pressures down into boreholes into rocks, and it cracks the rocks, and this frees up gas that's there. So these are reservoirs of gas that traditional drilling techniques, basically you don't get enough gas coming out the hole to be worth bothering with. The rocks are too tight. So they drill the holes, they fill them up with high pressure water, the rock cracks, and that releases the gas. And this gas comes out, and they're beginning to find, I think, that they can get a lot of gas out quite quickly doing this. Unfortunately, it has two big drawbacks. Well, in fact, three big drawbacks. The first is that the liquids that they put down the holes can be nasty and can leak into water tables. So there's an environmental issue associated with the use of these things. The second is that at least one study has suggested that an awful lot of methane gets released to the atmosphere in this process. And so this gas is being touted as being cleaner than coal. It may actually not turn out to be that much cleaner than coal.
Yeah.
Having said that, if we did switch every coal power station over to this natural gas, it would result in a reduction of emissions. So that would be a good thing. And this is the third drawback. The third drawback, to my mind, is the biggest. If we develop a lot of this gas, and we can get it out at really cheap prices, which some of the people who are pushing very hard for fracking for shale gas, if they're saying they can get the gas out at really low prices, what that does is it makes it harder for renewables to get into the market.
Yeah, exactly.
So you end up with a situation where the gas is not substitute renewables. It makes it harder for renewables. You're still getting emissions from burning this gas.
Yeah, and if you want to know how bad this stuff can get, this reminds me that there is a great film out. I haven't seen it yet, but I've seen the trailer for it, and I do want to get a hold of it. It's called Gasland.
Oh yes, I've heard about
that. Filmmaker Jason Fox, he went on a cross-country odyssey in the States, uncovering a trail of secrets, lies, and contamination. A recently drilled nearby Pennsylvania town reports that residents are able to light their drinking water on fire. This is just one of the many absurd and astonishing revelations of the film Gasland, and through all this whole process of so-called fracking, as you said. Terrible stuff. So perhaps if they're going to be planning that in New Zealand, I think we need to get Gasland seen on the big screen here. I know it was at the film festival at one point, but this needs to get out there.
Yeah, well, I'm worried generally, as is my co-blogger Brian, that our government here in New Zealand seems to be going hell for leather for fossil fuel exploitation. And perhaps isn't quite so keen on the other stuff that we really need to be doing, because even if shale gas is some kind of bridge to the future, it may be a bridge going nowhere. It may be a diversion from what we really need to do. So anyway, I just thought this is a solution that doesn't work. Has the potential to be a dangerous diversion. So we've thrown it in at the end of the show, just maybe start a conversation, but just because I was a bit depressed, actually, by seeing that people were thinking of doing it here. I mean, why?
All right. Hey, well, and seeing as you're depressed, do you think we've got time for some feedback? That might pick us up a little bit. So open up the mailbag. For the virtual mailbag, just running through one of the comments on the climateshow.com on the last show. Byrne said, regarding the comment on the show on the prospects for another warm summer in Europe, there are plenty of serious wildfires in Russia, mostly in eastern parts so far this year, with one article made reference to uncontrolled peat fires near Moscow, which we didn't know about during the last show.
Yeah, absolutely. And the heat wave continues, I think, in Western Europe, or they may have had a slight break recently, but yes, it's one to watch. And please do keep the feedback coming. We do like it, even if you are sometimes rude about our umming and ahhing.
Or rude about my travel to Japan. Do we want to address that? That was pointed out that doing a show about climate change, and then I go and take a fossil fuel trip to Japan.
Yeah, well, that's Well, I've just been talking to Glenn. I'm going to tell our readers that I'm going to go to Europe in August and the US.
Well, okay. The rebuttal.
I promised to plant a lot of trees.
I haven't weighed in there, but anyway, Byrne did respond to that as well. He said, regarding the early comments from Wayne, and Wayne, we didn't delete your comment, by the way. He thought we deleted a comment. No, it's still there. You can go check it out. Anyway, he said, so I expect you'll be selling your car, turning off your PC, your refrigerator, your heater, air conditioner, and turning vegetarian then. Only eating food you grow in your back garden. My point being that effective action on climate doesn't have to mean giving up everything we've achieved as a civilization. If air travel were our only source of GHG emissions, we wouldn't have a problem. It only accounts for 1.6% of human emissions. Is that correct, Gareth? I don't know the exact figure there.
It's of that order.
Yeah.
It certainly is not as big as coal power generation.
And
certainly.
Road transport accounts, he says, for nearly 10%. I don't know. Is it true? We're probably around that.
Yeah, I wouldn't quarrel with those numbers. It's quite reasonable. It's just I'm going back to what I said with David Caroli at that conference in when we had him on the show. I interviewed him, and we were talking about looking at individual carbon budgets, where if you wanted to come in under 2 degrees or under 1.5 degrees or wherever you wanted to be, each individual had a certain number of tons.
Yeah.
And I just know that by going off like this to Europe and then the US, I will be using a large chunk of my lifetime allowance.
But also, I mean, one thing I would say is that by not travelling, are we helping these companies come up with alternative forms of transport, alternative forms of fuel for in the future? I think, or would we just be helping them go out of business if we didn't travel on them?
Well, I don't know, Glenn. It's a difficult topic. At least one of the readers at Hot Topic who writes for us occasionally, Tom Benyon, has decided to stop flying completely,
Right.
and he conducts all his business in New Zealand using rail and public transport and so on, and is able to function quite effectively. So maybe we'll get Tom on the show at some point.
Does it matter that I only drive a scooter? I think that helps.
It would matter if it was an electric scooter.
Yeah. Well, I'm not. I mean, how much fuel am I using? I'm using about 6 litres of fuel every 2 weeks. So, yeah.
That's pretty good. That's pretty good. That makes up for a few beers at microbreweries in Tokyo.
It does, I think. And I just one more piece of feedback. Fungal Strumpet, I hope I said that right, said, "Hi, thanks for the show. You asked for suggestions regarding guests. How about his lordship, Lord Monkton?" Get John Cook at the same time, he says, and have a bucket of water ready to bring it to a close.
Actually, if we had Lord Monkton on, what I would like to do is to recreate the bit in that TV show, the outrageous British interviewer whose name completely escapes me, who has a red chair and people come on and they're supposed to...
Yes, what's his name every Friday night?
Yeah, absolutely. And he has this
well.
big red chair, and people are supposed to tell their favourite anecdote. And he's got this lever, and he pulls the lever, and the chair tips them out. So if we had Monkton on the show, I'd have to have a big red chair like that.
Yeah, that sounds good.
If I can remember the guy's name, I'll put it in the show notes.
It's always in the heat of the show. You always forget everything. Anyway, that has been a show.
Age.
Yeah, you and me both. Right, well, if you want to go and check out the various versions of the show, the audio or the video, you can find the links up at theclimateshow.com and also hot-topic.co.nz. Do a search through Stitcher.com, and download the app through your app store. Also iTunes as well, The Climate Show over there. Tell your friends about it. Tell anyone who you think would be really interested in the show. If you've got a blog, embed it in your blog. Share alike. I think it's YouTube now has a Creative Commons license, and I put it within that, so you can go and cut it up and do whatever you want with it, really.
Yeah, fantastic.
Yeah. Until next time, we'll be back in a couple of weeks with another special guest and more John Cook and more of us. It's going to be good.
And that's all.
That's
okay. All. So thanks to all our listeners, and we will be talking to you again soon.
All right. See you, Gareth.
Cheers, Glenn. Be good.
What